Welcome into 29 here for another Topic of the Week video. Christmas month continues with another positive Resident Evil topic. This week's topic was submitted by Tumblr anon, and their topic is Resident Evil 2 Remake is coming out soon. But what is it about the original that's so good? What made it so timeless to us despite being set in the 90s? What made it a great story? What did it do right in terms of the horror genre? And we already know some changes and some things kept in the remake, but what about what we don't know yet? What changes would you like to see? What things do you wish to see remain? Now, first off, I want to say that I didn't play Resident Evil 2 and then back when it came out. I mean, I was late 90s. I was like 7 when this game came out. So, at the time, I was playing games like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and Super Smash Bros. And since I was a kid, I wasn't exactly allowed to play rated M games, and I didn't really have the interest. My first experience in playing Resident Evil was actually Resident Evil 4 on the Wii. Got this as a gift for my birthday, and this was actually, I was like, wow, this is an amazing game. So then that's what got me into the series and get me into the characters and into the lore, and then I started checking out the other stuff, and I wasn't really big on playing tank controls. Most of the stuff I watched on Let's Plays on YouTube to get through all the old games because I'm not as good at tank controls. So looking back at Resident Evil 2, talking about it as a horror game, it doesn't exactly scare me now because the graphics are really outdated. And that's just something that happens with the passage of time. I mean, even Resident Evil 4, despite it looking great today, even, just with a slight upscaling of textures and stuff, it still looks pretty good, even if it is obviously, like, over 10 years old. The PlayStation era games, not so much. So when you look at stuff, it's not exactly super scary. But I did think, in terms of the horror genre, it did do a few things right. Now, I confess, I'm not exactly big on horror. What I like about Resident Evil is mostly the characters and the gameplay. And which is why I got so engrossed in Resident Evil 4. Specifically the Wii edition, because I actually really love the Wii edition. Now, I'm not really, I don't really watch horror movies or something, so Resident Evil is some of the only horror that I actually consume, funnily enough. But I did like the feeling of, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, that you get when you're playing the game, and especially playing Resident Evil 4, and you got a chainsaw guy coming at you, and you get too close and you're dead. And that kind of stuff still happens in the old games. In Resident Evil 2, I mean, especially with tank controls, I've never been too good with tank controls. So when you're dealing with, stuff that can kill you, it's oh crap, kind of a thing. So I'm not going to really spend too much time on that because it's not really something that I'm really big on anyway. But one thing I do want to really talk about is the story. The story of Resident Evil 2 is... it's got your B-movie cheese. Honestly, it's nothing like super amazing, and it can get a little confusing, especially with you have the multiple scenarios, and with Claire and Leon, and the story changes depending on it, so it can get a little confusing of what exactly is the canon of this. So, but if you just look at the story, I think the story is fine. In fact, considering some of the stuff out around the time, I mean, aside from things like Metal Gear Solid, which actually had a pretty darn good story, generally that stuff, stories in the 90s for video games the bar wasn't too high. So I think Resident Evil hit, it was, for the most part, acceptable. What I think it really excelled at more so than the story, which the story did, expand on stuff, and it did continue things from Resident Evil 1, because, you had, the whole, the Spencer Mansion incident, and then it's like, okay, now that there's stuff that's gotten out, and now we're dealing with, Resident Evil, what do I say? Now we're dealing with Raccoon City, and all the stuff in the outbreak there. But what I think it really excelled at more so than the first game is actually the characters. Now, Resident Evil 1, in terms of its story and its characters, is really better in hindsight when you have things like Resident Evil 0 and Remake. Remake really, really kind of stepped up some things, and I think it really helped, being able to take some of the stuff more seriously with much better graphics. And Resident Evil 0 gives things like what was going on in the mansion incident, and even characters like Wesker and Birkin, you get more context on them and what they're doing around this time. So when you have all the full context of stuff, it actually really does make things a lot more enjoyable when you have the bigger picture, and especially when you get to see things like, particularly when you see more of Wesker in Resident Evil 0 in some of the cutscenes, so that when he comes back in Code Veronica, okay, now that we have a bit more stuff like context for this, especially in Resident Evil Remake, where you see Wesker actually injecting himself with the stuff that's going to bring him back as Super Wesker. Resident Evil 2 hasn't really gotten as much of that, but what I said before is it really, really excels with the characters, particularly the playable characters as compared to Resident Evil 1. With Resident Evil 1, STARS were basically like a SWAT team, essentially, from Raccoon City, and they were sent in, to kind of investigate what the hell is going on here, and pretty much all of them ended up dead. Now, you play as Chris and Jill, and I love Chris and Jill, and, especially seeing a bit more of them, later in, Code Veronica, and then, frankly, we haven't seen as much about Jill. But you got games like Revelation, and I even like some bits with Jill in Resident Evil 5, but, you get to see more of them, and I liked seeing, some of that stuff. And I talked about Resident Evil 5, how it, pushed the characters forward with Chris and Jill, and seeing them work in the BSAA. And it's like, okay, alright, I like this. But, with Resident Evil, Chris and Jill weren't super, I wouldn't say they were super relatable at the time. Seeing them fleshed out more really helps. But with Leon and Claire, I think it's a lot easier to relate to their characters, because instead of being like specially trained SWAT team, you got Leon, who's a rookie cop, and his first day in the job walks right into the zombie apocalypse. And then you got Claire, who's pretty much a normal girl. She's just your average, average woman coming in, and she's had a little bit of help training from her brother. And that's actually something that really makes her more interesting, is the fact that she's related to Chris. She's Chris's sister. So you actually have the story of her looking for Chris. So that's your main real connection with these characters to the first game. Okay, where's Chris? So then you got a little bit more interesting stuff going on. And so when you ultimately get into like Code Veronica and they end up reuniting, it's like, okay, that's sort of that plot line continuing on through multiple games. But that's really Claire's driving motivation, so she's trying to find her brother. But then being more normal is, I actually, I think it makes them a little bit more relatable. I also think that, in terms of the story is fine. It's nothing too amazing. And the voice acting is... The voice acting was decent for the time. I mean, looking back, it could be super cheesy. Ada, wait. And, and of course, at the time with the script, it could be a little awkward. I mean, it was the late 90s, and you had translations, and voice acting wasn't super the best. I mean, you still had cheese from like the first game with, oh, you were almost a Jill sandwich, which, to be fair, was one of the funniest lines in the entire game, if not the series. But, you could take it seriously enough. I mean, looking back, it's like, that's super cheesy. But, like, Resident Evil 6, it does, or was it, what am I saying? Resident Evil 2, I'm talking about 2. It's still got that charm, and I do think it has a little bit more charm than the original in that regard. Mainly, I think I like the characters more. I mean, you got Leon, you got Claire, you got Ada, who turns out to be like a spy. Then you got William Birkin and, and then Annette Birkin and then Sherry. And you got that whole plot line going on. And, just talking about stuff that was actually kind of scary. One thing that is interesting is the plot line with William Birkin. infecting himself with the G virus. Yeah, I'm going to admit the G virus stuff is actually kind of terrifying. It's like, yeah, he infects himself, and unlike the T virus, which could just infect people and basically turn them into zombies, the G virus, it needed a specific, the specific genetic match, which is why Birkin was hunting down his daughter Sherry to infect her. And it's like, and then you got this innocent little girl who's just adorable, and it's like, yeah, you want to protect this girl. And I do think that is kind of, scary to think about what would happen if Birkin was successful. It's like, ugh. Even with some low poly, models and low textures, it's like, it's kind of scary. And then you've got things like Lickers. Yeah, I do admit, Lickers are pretty scary. And I actually liked seeing them in Resident Evil Damnation, where you actually get to see them in glorious detail. And yeah, they're pretty scary. Mr. X, Mr. X in terms of just this giant brick wall that's walking around trying to kill you. And you can just burst it out of nowhere. And it's like, oh crap. But, I think, the story isn't, great. If you look at it, if you're looking at this from a critical, objective perspective, it's not, super amazing, but it doesn't really have to be amazing. It mostly needs to serve the gameplay, especially for a game that's not super heavy on story. But what's there in the story is pretty good. And it's got characters who are still to this day some of the most popular characters in the franchise. Leon is practically the face of Resident Evil now. He is everywhere, and people loved him. And especially when he came back in Resident Evil 4 as a super awesome government agent, doing front flips and outrunning boulders and having awesome knife fights. It's like, okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. And his popularity skyrocketed. Claire is still really popular, which is kind of odd that they keep kind of shoving her to the side and messing her up, especially in Revelations 2. Ugh. And then Ada's still really popular. Ada made it into Damnation. Ada is one of the characters who returned in Resident Evil 4, even if you didn't see too much of her. I mean, outside of things like Assignment Ada in separate ways. So, Resident Evil 2 did a really good job with the characters because those have endured. Now, when it comes to remaking this, there was a debate of whether they would follow the Resident Evil remake, where it would be the classic controls, but, everything's just updated, or if it would follow the more third-person shooter controls. And they went with the latter, and a lot of people did worry that this would wreck the game and being scary if it didn't have tank controls. And I think with the gameplay that we've seen, I think we can put those worries to rest. One of the a lot of people would worry if it would be like Resident Evil 6, where it's just shooting, and it's not really that scary. It's it's mostly an action game. But when you have things that are meant to help with that, and this is one of the things that I've always said about Resident Evil 6. The controls in and of themselves aren't bad. It's the way the game was designed. And with Resident Evil 2 Remake, you got the third-person shooter controls, but then you have places where it's just lights are out, and hey, you remember your handy knife? That's got durability now. And you're going to have to find a new one if that breaks. So it really, really does stuff to help with that. And I do appreciate that, in that they didn't just slap on Resident Evil 6 controls and go, sure, why not? There's actually thought put into it, and I do really like that. Now, in terms of the changes that we've seen, I've talked a little bit about the changes of the gameplay and stuff, but in terms of the changes, one thing I do want is expansion. You have this opportunity to expand on the details and, show more. And we've already seen that with characters like Marvin. Marvin in the original he didn't really have a huge role. He was there to just kind of push things along a little, and he turned into a zombie. But in Resident Evil 2 Remake, he's helping out more. You're going to see him more. And it's like, oh yeah, awesome. It's like, I like seeing more of his character. Well, that's just going to make the gut punch all the worse when he turns into a zombie, because now he's helped you out more. And you're more attached to his character. He's not just one of those random NPCs that you see and he's just like, hey guys, here's something for the plot. And then he dies. I mean, that stuff does happen in Resident Evil. A lot, actually. So it is nice to see that. And, you know, I do want to see more expansions on stuff. I would love to, like, in terms of the, you know, the characters and story in game, I like that there's more, you know, expansive the areas. I like how you get to walk around. Like, you see the police station. Seeing the police station is actually really cool from, you know, in updated modern graphics. And I do want, and I want to see more, and I expect that they're just going to be doing that with all of the areas of the game, where it's actually more expanded and there's more you can do. And things changed up, so it's not just the exact same scenarios that you went through before. It's like, okay, yeah, similar, but then there's a whole lot more going on. Now, I would like to see more with the characters. I mean, I don't know exactly how much depth they're going to be going with Claire and Leon, but I would like to see them add a little bit more than what we got before. With Claire specifically, I do want them to deal more with her and her brother. I do want to learn a little bit more about her and Chris. You know, I've always really liked that relationship, so it's such an utter shame that they've only been able to interact in one game. Code Veronica. And since then, even when it makes sense, they just don't interact. Like, where were Claire and Jill in Resident Evil 6 for Chris's campaign? Whatever. So I'd like to see more of that. Particularly, not just the what we got before, and the I'm looking for my brother kind of a thing. I do like to hear a little bit more about it. Would like to learn a little bit more. Because, you know, we don't really get too much in terms of the backstory for a lot of these characters. So getting a little bit more would actually be nice. I would also like to see a bit more in terms of an epilogue that's sort of like... I want to see something that sort of leads into Claire going into Code Veronica. Even if they don't like end up making a Code Veronica remake, I would like to see something that sets up her going and trying to find her brother again. Not just what we got at the end of Resident Evil 2, but more so in the... Maybe getting a little bit more of her going to that, you know, Umbrella facility that, you know, that we see her in at the beginning of Code Veronica. And maybe with Leon, like, incorporating a bit of that Resident Evil 3 epilogue for Leon that shows him being interrogated and basically being brought in to work for the government. Which, if I remember correctly, I believe Darkside Chronicles included that. I haven't played all the way through Darkside Chronicles, but I'm pretty sure that's in that sort of campaign where you get to see Leon being brought in to work for the government. So I would actually love to see that to sort of set that up more. I think it would also be interesting if, in terms of expansions, if we got some references to things like Resident Evil 3, because Resident Evil 3 happens along the same time as Resident Evil 2. So it'd be interesting if there were some details that showed things that were going on, of things Jill was doing at the time. And I mean, I'm not saying something major. Like, I don't want them to have like a full-on crossover where Jill shows up. I'm just saying stuff that sort of acknowledges that. And it would actually be kind of neat if we got a Resident Evil 3 remake to sort of like complete that sort of saga. So that you have the whole Resident Evil, like the Raccoon City storyline. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to see a lot of that stuff in terms of the story, and I like what we have. I like what we have seen. So it's so far it's made a really good impression. I was a little concerned when I first heard about it. I'm like, okay, what are you doing, Capcom? I'm gonna wait for word, Capcom, because you screwed up a whole lot of stuff. I'm like, I think we all still remember Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, and I'm not too impressed with Devil May Cry 5. But I'm like, okay. And I saw it, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you know, this is pretty good, actually. Yeah, good job, Capcom. I mean, we've yet to see the full thing, and I'm actually really excited to see. I mean, I love all the, you know, the outfits that we're getting. A lot of the classic outfits look good. one thing I want to bring up, while I'm generally fine with Claire's classic outfit in Resident Evil 2 Remake, I would at least like them to add in a variant that has the proper undershirt. This isn't an issue of, oh my gosh, they're sexualizing Claire. Because, I mean, yeah, you can see a little bit more skin. It's mostly from a design perspective, because the original outfit, when she had the vest and she had the black undershirt underneath, and it looks weird without it. And it's like, and that's just bugging me from a design perspective. It's like, I don't mind if the one that they have is still in the game. I honestly, I'm fine with that. I'm totally fine with that. I just would like them to add one with the proper undershirt, just because that is the classic design. So I just want to see that put in. That's in terms of the outfits. That's mainly the one thing I would really want to talk about. It's just like, I just want them to add a variant of that so that Claire has like a true classic outfit. Leon's looks great, so I don't really have any complaints about that. So yeah, most of the outfits are great. I really love the noir outfits. Those look amazing. So yeah, in terms of the stuff from the original that I'd like to see remain, I would like to see all the major moments. I mean, I'm sure they're going to pick all of the major, more iconic moments. Now, when it comes to talking about like the bigger story moments, there are a few that are sort of conflicting, and so I guess it would be nice to see the canon moments, like what happens to Ada does change a little depending on the scenarios. I'd actually another expansion. I would like to see a little bit more with Annette Birkin. It's like I'd like to see a little bit more of this stuff to really kind of delve into Sherry's backstory a little bit more, so that we have a little bit more context of her and the relationship with her parents. Because we've always had a little bit of that, but I'd like to see. It's one of those things. It's the expansion on what we got. I like what we had before, and this game isn't really going to supersede canon, really, because Resident Evil 2, the original, is still going to be the main version of it. But I would like to see something that's a little bit more consistent in that regard, because even the Resident Evil Remake still had, things changed depending on if you were playing as Jill or if you were playing as Chris. But overall, Resident Evil 2 Remake does look good, and I am excited on getting my hands on it and playing it and going through that game when it does eventually come out. And it looks, from what we've seen so far, it looks like it's going to be a great remake that's really updating Resident Evil 2 to the modern, era. But without losing, it being a horror game. But I actually think it might actually be scarier than the original in some cases. It'll definitely be scarier than Resident Evil 6. And, being, it's a good direction to head in, for future games. So yeah, I think that's about it for this topic. If you want to comment on a new topic below, I'm definitely accepting more topics about Resident Evil, especially positive ones. And you can comment below if you're on YouTube or if you're on Tumblr. You can send me an ask, put topic, then whatever topic you want me to talk about. Just make sure to follow the rules that I'll be posting down below. If you want to watch last week's topic video, you can check that out here. If you want to watch next week's topic video, you can check that out here when I get that done. So are there any good things that you have to say about Resident Evil 2? What did you love about it? What are you looking forward to in Resident Evil 2 Remake? Please comment below. And thank you for watching.